All right, welcome to part C. In this part of the lecture, we're going to evaluate the New Deal, how it did, the economic performance. We'll look at some data in a new recession in 1937, 1938 that soured the public's attitude a bit about FDR. All right, so here is in the index, New York Stock Exchange. Again, late 1920s. Look at that bubble. Oh my gosh. Look at that bubble. How did people not see that? You gotta wonder, but they didn't. Well, most of them didn't. And then just crash. A little bit of a rebound in early 1930, crash. And, bam. And by the time Roosevelt was inaugurated in March, early March, at quite a low point. Well, stock market bounces back a little bit in 33 and 1934, but it's still at a very low point. I mean, that's, mid 1931 levels. How does the Fed respond? Well, the Fed cuts interest rates. Now, the Fed had raised interest rates after the summer of 1931 in response to Europe going off the gold standard and in response to the outflow of gold from the United States in 1932. The Fed raised rates, but they didn't raise them enough to stop the gold outflow. You remember in part A of the video, I said you really had two options here. You either hike rates up even more and experience in a short term even more deflation and perhaps even more severe contraction, but then you're able to retain the gold standard, liquidate the unsound businesses, and then build up from there. Or you just go off gold. You just repudiate the gold standard, and that latter option is essentially what FDR does. And the Fed, under FDR's first term, cuts interest rates and settles at 1.5%, where it remains for a couple years. So low interest rates from the Fed, and the money supply returns to that 1928, early 1929 level. And that really was the goal of FDR in this early period, was to reflate back to late 1920s levels. And you can see it's achieved there. And look at that. Wow. There's the stock market. By the end of 1936, the stock market has rebounded quite a bit. Now, it's not at the peak in early 1929, but still, that's pretty darn good. It's at where the economy was in early 1930, so things are going well. FDR wins Reelection in 1936 in a total landslide. FDR had experienced some opposition on his left flank, from Huey Long and some other figures, Francis Townsend, but he responds to that by passing the Social Security Act in 1935, the Wagner Act in 1935 as well, which offered protections for labor unions, a minimum wage, and FDR wins very easily in 1936. And look at those numbers, real GDP, quite a some significant increases after years of loss. But here's the sour data. Look at that. Unemployment still hasn't gone below 10%. That's really bad for Roosevelt. And this is at the end of 1936 when the stock market's all the way back up here. Unemployment's gone down. It's no longer 25%. But as late as 1935, unemployment was still over 20% in 1935. Right? Roosevelt, by that point, had been president for 3 years, or almost 3 years, 2.5 years, and it's 20%. It wasn't even until summer of 1936 that the unemployment rate even went below 15%. So unemployment is still very, very high in the United States. The unemployment rate at the end of 1936 is where it was in summer of 1931. So that's a big problem for Roosevelt here. And then in August of 1937, stock market crashes again in what historians call the Recession of 1937, or what some contemporaries called the Roosevelt Recession, because by this point, FDR has been in office now for 4.5 years. This is clearly on him from the public's angle, and that's a big dive. August of 1937, by the end of November 1937, the market had dropped 43% for the year. 43% drop in the market by the end of 1937. And now the market is at where it was in the second half of 1931. So, and it just kind of hangs around there for a while. In 1938, the recession lasted 13 months. Manufacturing output fell by 37%. 37% fall in manufacturing output. Personal income in the United States fell 15%. And then look at that, unemployment. Unemployment by the beginning of the year 1938 was right back up to 20%. So it's like, man, this has failed. What happened? We thought we were on our way back up. Unemployment was still in double digits, but maybe we'll get there. And then all of a sudden, late 1937, that's wiped out, and the U.S. is right back in recession. Public became very disillusioned with FDR as a result of the recession of 1937 and 1938, and his popularity goes down quite a bit. The Fed, by the way, responded to this by cutting interest rates further down to a single point, because the Fed by this point is committed to this sort of policy, right? Monetary expansion, and so crisis hits, you need to lower the interest rate. But yeah, this is the Dow Jones, and from 1937, 1938. It goes back up a little bit in 39, but really it's just hanging around. By the time 1940 hits, the stock market is where it was in late 1931 still. So much of the public sees this as a failure. And in fact, actually, in 1938, in the congressional elections, Republicans did very well. They didn't take the House. They didn't take the Senate, but they gained seats, and then a lot of conservative Democrats were brought into the House, who, though Democrats, formed a coalition with Republicans to put the brakes on any more New Deal programs. And so the New Deal, basically, after 1936, the New Deal is over. There's no more action will be taken from that point forward. So one of the last efforts made by FDR was court packing. It proved very unpopular. A lot of conservative Democrats turned on him, and it failed. So, FDR is not looking so good, and he's getting a lot of heat from the right and from the left and from folks who are difficult to define exactly. Father Coughlin was one of those. Father Coughlin was a Roman Catholic priest based out of Detroit, Michigan. And he had a radio program, and his radio program was massive audience. About 30 million, maybe as many as 40 million listeners tuned into his weekly broadcast. He supported FDR in 1932 and 1933, but by 1934 he turned and believed that FDR had been too friendly to the bankers. And you might say, wow, that contradicts what we learned in Part B, where FDR enraged the Morgan Bank because of all the new banking acts and the transfer of power from the New York Fed and the move from gold. Morgan didn't like that, and that's true. However, FDR had a lot of banker allies who were all on board with the banking acts, all on board with with what they saw as perhaps bolstering their own financial position. Father Coughlin sees this and accuses FDR of making his bed with these bankers. Father Coughlin started a newspaper called Social Justice and started an organization called National Union for Social Justice, and had a huge circulation, especially by the mid to late 1930s. And he used it, among other things, to call for nationalizing the Federal Reserve. And he had huge rallies. And I actually want to show a brief clip of one of those rallies where he talks about the Federal Reserve. So let's hear what he had to say.
There is written in the Constitution of the United States that Congress has the right to coin, issue, and regulate the value of money. That's good Americanism, and it's good enough for me. Every politician today, in the Democratic or Republican rank, who sits upon one of the thrones of the mighty, doesn't believe in that part of the Constitution. They don't want to believe in that part of the Constitution. They believe that the Federal Reserve Bank has the right to coin and regulate the value of money. They're not even Americans, these so-called Democrats and Republicans. And so, Mr. Roosevelt, who was very loquacious in 1933 about driving the money changers out of the temple, is now bent upon another policy. I think driving the workmen out of decent annual wages.
Oh, look at that crowd there. So that's a huge rally. But by 1939, FDR just wants to completely shut his program down, and succeeds in that. Tells Charles Coughlin, you need a permit for your radio program. He applied for a permit, was refused a permit, but FDR succeeded in shutting him down, and then prohibited the U.S. mail from disseminating his newspaper, Social Justice. So, FDR maybe made some First Amendment violations there in shutting Charles Coughlin down. But huge following, very, very massive following, and really he reflected a growing dissatisfaction in the United States with the administration. I mean, look at that. It's, again, before World War II, the economy seems to be going nowhere. So there's a lot of frustration, a lot of pent-up anger that he's able to channel. There's the Federal Reserve Building, the Eccles Building, as it was later called, constructed in 1937. Look at that 1930s style architecture. Constructed in 1937. So that is where the Federal Reserve Board meets, in Washington, D.C. For Part D of Lecture 34, we're going to take a look at who that Fed chairman was, Mariner Stoddard Eccles, and we will take a look at the great debate over the Great Depression between John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. So see you for Part D.